Hey historians, this is Mrs. Tyler. Today we are doing Unit 3 Notes for A Nation Divided. Okay, these are the pages in our notes packet that we will be completing. At the very front of our notes packet on page 2, we have our timeline. So would you please record the following dates that need to go on our Unit 3 timeline. Lincoln elected president in 1860, and then in 1861 the Civil War began at Fort Sumter. Okay. Since the writing of the Constitution in 1787, the northern and southern states had already been making compromises about slavery. Way back at the start of the year, we talked about the 3/5 compromise and how the South had basically threatened to not to walk out of the Constitutional Convention if they felt like their interests in slavery weren't going to be represented. So by 1860, the nation was more divided than ever. It was an election year, and the presidential race revealed how deeply divided the country had become. The election of 1860 had the following 4 candidates. Abraham Lincoln from the Republican Party. His stance on slavery was that slavery should be limited to where it already exists and not be allowed to spread into new states and territories. This is Stephen Douglas from the Democratic Party in the North. He argued that he didn't like the slave codes because they often got violent, but he thought that territories and new states should be able to vote and decide on slavery for themselves. John Breckinridge was the Democratic candidate from the South. He supported the slave codes to protect slave owners, and he thinks that the new territories and new states should decide for themselves about slavery. And the last candidate was a man named John Bell. He was a Constitutional Union Party, and he didn't really want to talk about slavery. He wanted to just kind of focus on the things that'll keep the nation together. Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, but his victory was odd because he won with only 40% of the votes. This means that there were 60% of the voters in the United States who did not favor Lincoln and didn't want him to be president. His name didn't even show up on 10 ballots for some of the southern states. So the remaining 60% of those votes, though, were divided between the other 3 candidates, so Lincoln ended up having the largest number of electoral college votes. Lincoln's election meant that the southern states that supported slavery were in the minority, so those states are going to fear that sooner or later, with more representatives from the North in Congress and a president who is a northern anti-slavery president, they could definitely start to write laws that could abolish slavery, and Abraham Lincoln would be the kind of president that would sign and support that kind of legislation and turn it into law. So Southerners really felt that their liberty, property, and their entire way of life was at risk. Abe Lincoln became the 16th president. He's determined to keep the U.S. together. This quote kind of says a lot to me. He said, I would save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. So this is the election map results from the election of 1860. And you can kind of see the gray areas. A lot of kids were asking about these gray areas. These are territories that are not allowed to vote yet. This is the first time that Minnesota could vote in the presidential election because they had become a state in 1858. You also can see that there's kind of a deep divide. Most of the true northern states are voting for Lincoln for the Republican Party, and the deep southern states that are pro-slavery are voting for Breckinridge. In between, you have some votes for Bell and Stephen Douglas, and that's because these guys are going to be caught in the middle should there be any sort of war breaking out over slavery. All right, we have a timeline leading to Civil War. 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. November 6th, 1860. There's a lot of cause and effect with this set of notes, so that's why I wanted us to track some of these events so you can see the cause and effect. Lincoln's election sent shockwaves through the South. The southern states felt that they no longer had a voice in government, and they began to talk of breaking away from the Union. One Virginia newspaper stated, "The honor, safety, and independence of the southern people are only to be found if we form our own Southern Confederacy." The United States Senate decides to hold a meeting before everybody leaves to go home for Christmas on December 20th, 1860. They're trying to come up with a last-minute compromise to satisfy the southern states. Meanwhile, the very same day in South Carolina's state legislature, they were meeting and they had a vote, and they decided to formally leave the Union. South Carolina became the first state to secede. Okay, on page 9 in our notes, we have the definition of secede. Would you please highlight 3 of those context clues for me? Okay, so South Carolina became the first state to formally secede or leave the Union, December 20th, 1861. Lincoln had promised that he would not interfere with slavery in the South, but it was too late. He hadn't even taken office yet. He doesn't take the oath of office until March 4th of 1861, but already the nation was crumbling apart. By February of 1861, 6 more states had joined South Carolina. So before Abraham Lincoln was even sworn into office as president, he's got 7 states that have decided to secede. They felt that since the states voluntarily joined the U.S., they could voluntarily leave. Ultimately, 4 more than that would end up joining the Confederacy to total 11. Secession is both wrong and unconstitutional. In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not mine, is this momentous issue of civil war. Basically, Lincoln is saying, if there's a war over this, this is not my fault. You have made this choice. Just because you're dissatisfied with the election results does not mean you get to just up and leave. And he felt that that was wrong and unconstitutional. So we're going to highlight the chunk of land, the area of land that makes up those Confederate states, the ones, all 11 of them that broke away. This is the 11 slave states that seceded. It makes up about 9 million people. So I had my students today grab a color pencil and color in all of those southern Confederate states. The Confederacy, this is on page 9, the 11 southern states that seceded and withdrew from the U.S. The Confederacy quickly elected former Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis as their president, and they wrote down their own constitution. They established a capital that was only about 100 miles away from Washington, D.C., so the capital of the South is going to be Richmond, Virginia. The Stars and Bars flag was the original Confederate flag. However, once war broke out, it was really difficult to tell the difference between this Stars and Bars flag and then the United States flag, because both had the red and white stripes and the blue field in the corner. So ultimately, they switch it out for the Virginia battle flag, and the South's Confederate flag ends up being this recognizable as this Confederate flag, the one that was the Virginia battle flag. Jefferson Davis was elected president of the 11 Confederate states that seceded. By spring of 1861, 10 more states had separated from the Union. Secession is the act of seceding from an organization or group. The states and territories that did not secede were referred to as the Union. States on the border had to choose. 4 slave states, known as border states, remained in the Union. The Southwest Territories of Virginia ended up breaking away from the state and remained with the Union, forming the state of West Virginia. So we end up with Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. All of those form the border states. They are slave states. They allow slavery, but they choose not to secede with the rest of the slave states. Okay? They believe in keeping the United States together. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated and became the leader of a broken nation. In his inauguration speech, he spoke to both Union and Confederate citizens, extending peace and friendship. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, it must not break our bonds of affection. Okay, and we also need to color in the North. Okay, 19 free states and 8 Western territories, 22 million people. Okay. Union. The United States is one nation governed by a single government, also came to mean the states, government, and armies of the North. And the border states, states that allowed slavery but chose to remain in the Union and not secede or join the Confederacy. Lincoln's offer of friendship is rejected. Confederate states took over all U.S. federal buildings, including all the military forts and post offices. Lincoln had to decide how he was going to respond. One of the most urgent problems was that the commander at Fort Sumter in South Carolina refused to surrender the military fort to the Confederate troops. He had about 100 U.S. troops stationed there with him. South Carolina decided to cut off the fort and try to starve out the 100 U.S. troops and hope that they would just surrender the fort instead of starving to death. Lincoln said he's got to do something, but he knows that if he sends supplies and reinforcement troops that would cause more states to secede. So he just decides to send food to keep his soldiers alive. Well, this didn't matter. Confederate leaders still took it as an act of aggression, and on the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on the U.S. troops at Fort Sumter. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. And last, we end up in a civil war. The South attacked Fort Sumter. War begins April 12, 1861. Robert E. Lee was a West Point graduate and U.S. military officer at the start of the war. Lincoln wanted him to command the Union Army, but Lee chose to fight for his home state of Virginia, and he was appointed to be the head commander of the Confederate Army. Robert E. Lee remained loyal to his home state of Virginia and commanded the Confederate Army. Okay, so on the right side in the bottom of your page, you've got the Confederacy. It's the 11 states that seceded. They were fighting to leave the Union. They argued that they had rights granted by protected by the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution of the Bill of Rights that gave states the rights to make laws that were not completely and already decided by the Constitution. So they felt that it was up to them to decide whether or not they allowed slavery. Soldiers fighting for the Confederacy were nicknamed rebels because they were rebelling against the U.S. government, and their uniforms were a gray, tannish color, basically whatever they could get available to them, because they aren't going to always have access to fabric and material all the time. We'll talk about that in tomorrow's notes. The nickname given to the soldiers fighting the Confederate Army or the South are the rebels. Okay. President Lincoln struggled to find a general that met his standards. He fired multiple generals for not being aggressive enough against the better trained Southern soldiers. In 1863, he appointed General Ulysses S. Grant to lead the Union Army. Grant had proven he was persistent and would win at all costs. General Grant was made commander of the Union Army in 1863. And the Union Army, the Union is made up of 19 free states, 8 western territories, and 5 border states. Their reason for fighting is to preserve the Union and keep the South from seceding. They're nicknamed the Yankees, which kind of is a slang term for city boy. And their uniforms are dark blue coats, sometimes like a light blue pants. Okay. And the nickname, Yankees, is given to the soldiers fighting for the Union Army or the North. All right, thanks for listening today, and see you soon.